Welcome to the Spin Nation podcast, where the podcast looks at the data to help you navigate the spin of the conversations that are impacting Canadians today. I'm your host, Laurel, and here with me always is my co host and lovely husband, Emmanuel.
Hello, lovely Laurel.
Lovely Laurel, I like that. So, today we're going to be talking about how international NGOs are losing influence in an evolving landscape. So, Emmanuel, do you pay much attention to NGOs overall, or are they just background noise to you?
Well, I feel like that's changed a lot in the last few decades. It seems to me like Greenpeace and some of the more activist NGOs were top of the hour for a lot of the news channels, but I feel like that's faded away over the years.
Yeah, they used to really leave a lasting impact, and they were really good at these big media stunts on, rolling down huge banners over the sides of buildings, putting those little boats up against the whalers. But it seems like Extinction Rebellion, I would say, is a one that has been trying to also activate some of these stunts. But if you think about the really big international ones that have been around for a long time, you're right. We don't hear about them as much anymore.
Yeah, and it's not from lack of trying. I do believe I've seen a few videos of boats of Greenpeace against, playing tag with the Japanese whalers, but it's just hasn't come up in the news and the major channels. You really have to look for it.
So we've got some data about that. Not our data, but we found another organization who had done some interesting research. And so we're going to start with our data of the week, our Le Chiffre de la Semaine. And that is that 50% reduction in output by the top 4 or 5 major international NGOs. So we're looking at like WWF, Oxfam, Greenpeace as examples. So that's our big data point for the week.
50%, that's a big drop. It seems to have started in early 2024 and down 50% by mid 2025.
So to say, I have spent some time working a good amount of my career working with different kinds of NGOs. Definitely worked with these big names that we talked about. I've also worked with very small local ones as well. And it's always been a difficult relationship to navigate, I would say, that it's been very obvious they have an agenda and a mission, and that, everyone understands that. But it is when it actually comes down to the engagement, there are definitely a group of NGOs that are highly productive, that are really interested in working with let's say, the corporate or the organization or institution to find a solution and, like, let's work together to have a positive outcome. But then there are groups of NGOs who actually are not looking to come to a mutually beneficial understanding or solution, that they're specifically to throw up barriers. And I think that is maybe where the, let's say, overall reputation of civil society NGOs, it's a bit checkered. It's not overly positive depending on who you talk to.
And why is that, you think?
Well, because I have seen it happen where corporates and entities invest a lot of time, make a lot of effort to address and work with NGOs to solve a problem. But then when push comes to shove, the NGO will turn on them, especially in the public. And that's part of how they're financed. So I think for people who aren't super familiar with how NGOs, they'll get their funding from big foundations, big donors. And if they're not being seen by those donors as being, let's say, quote unquote, impactful, but how is that impactfulness measured? And a lot of the times that impactfulness could be measured by creating bad media stories, bad social media campaigns. It's not necessarily about we want to get to a positive endpoint. It's more about we're here and we're being funded to challenge you at every step of the way.
So that makes it difficult to build, let's say, a collaborative relationship.
Exactly. And so there is a lot of skepticism with working with certain groups of NGOs, absolutely. Others are not like that. Others are great to work with, but not all the time. So I'm going to share now this data. So this is from a company called Sigwatch. They are out of London, and they look specifically at a large group of NGOs, big and small around the world.
Activist age.
Yeah, activists. And they have been tracking them for quite a while, and they put out this data this week, which I thought was really interesting. And they were comparing, let's say, the efficacy or the activity of Transparency International, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Greenpeace, and WWF. So those big five, let's call them the big five NGOs, with how active they've been compared to the broader set of activity of all the thousands of NGOs that they track.
And that's the red line on your screen.
For those who are watching, that's the red line. But then we come back to our data point of the day that has dropped. That activity has dropped by 50% from 2024 to currently to 2025 for these big international NGOs. And the theory being put forward is that they have become less effective or less important, and that the whole mechanism for activism and pressure campaigns has shifted away from them.
That's a significant downshift, and it's not directly tied to the election of Donald Trump. It starts in early, or it peaks in early 2024 and starts dropping right at the beginning of the year, all the way down to mid 2025. And if we compare that to the larger groups, so Sigwatch tracks 13,000 groups, that indice also drops at the same time, not by the same amount. Maybe it drops by about one third instead of 50%, but still a very significant downshift in their level of activity. And by activity, what we mean here is campaigns, press releases, social media output. So it's an overall measure of all the public facing activities that they're holding.
So, what does this mean if you're a company, you're a government? What does this shift say to you?
If if I'm a company and I see these NGOs are less active, well, I guess it's a question of cause and effect. Are they less active because there's less to do, or are they less active because it has less impact, or that they have fewer funds to finance these activities? Which of the three could it be?
Well, we don't have line of sight to whether their donor base is growing or shrinking. It it could be. There's a theory that these international NGOs, the forms via which they were most impactful, are not as important as they used to be. So Davos, you know, those would be those places.
Davos, yeah.
Yeah. COP. Not to say that these still aren't large events. They're still large events, but the importance of these really big global international events is dwindling.
Yes, I feel like being present at Davos was a must do a few years back, and all the CEOs, the prime ministers, and other country leaders would be there, as would a number of regional leaders, etc. But I kind of feel like this year it barely cracked a news cycle.
Yeah, so that mechanism via which these kinds of incredibly well governed and structured and funded NGOs would engage at these very high level, that has changed, and that's a little bit, it's out of fashion. And what we're seeing more of now, and I think this is what was definitely being suggested by Sigwatch, is that instead you have these much smaller, more agile, more digitally native individuals and organizations who are driving their own activism and leveraging their computers and the amount of power that they can develop by just really understanding how to jump on the right algorithms from a bunch of different social channels that are out there. And what that means that is if you're a company, how you monitor, manage, and engage and watch for campaigns that might be targeting you or your industry, it dramatically changes. It's less about I have a relationship with someone at WWF and I know they're going to call me or I'm going to call them and give me a heads up about something. And now you kind of have to have your feelers and tentacles out quite broadly in order to get an understanding of what may be emerging.
So I'm going to hazard a guess here, but a lot of the NGOs that were very active in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s. So this was 20, 30 years ago. But my assumption is these are the same people still running these organizations, and they're not necessarily as um, competent or have the same ability to leverage social media as the younger digital native community has. And I'm wondering, all of these organizations have now gone from their wild activist roots to more formal institutions that have boards of directors. They have contributor lists that they've been nurturing for years and decades. So they probably don't have the same fire that they used to have 30 years ago. And they're not as familiar with the tools that make today's effective communication campaigns. And so the initiative has been left to the counter narrative, the anti climate change narrative. And that has been driven a lot by the right side of politics. And I would argue that the right side of politics in the last 5 to 8 years has developed their digital marketing skills at a lot faster pace than those on the left. Just think of Robbie Starbucks. He was a campaigner trying to get DEI reversed across a number of U.S. corporations, and he was successful at reversing course at a number of organizations that he challenged. And part of his and I would say these organizations' success is the ability to leverage the network effect. So although Robbie Starbuck is an individual, he was able to leverage other significant influencers. Some of the big guys, whether it's I forget the name. Do you remember the names of these influencers that he leveraged? But I'm not sure if it's Nick Fuentes or Tim Pool or some of these other big names that suddenly explode the reach of this message, and they all work together towards this very countercultural message that they were so successful at communicating over the course of 2024 election cycle. That was a bit of a ramble.
It's okay.
So, what's your reflection? Is this a question of skills, where one group is, still playing in the old traditional media arena, primarily maybe, old social media like Facebook, and the new teams are more familiar with the new media that's emerging around YouTube and TikTok and podcasts and some of these other channels that have been developing in the last few years?
I think there is a perfect web of different factors at play. So I agree with you that what were once very agile and hard hitting NGOs have evolved into these institutions with the boards and everything, and so they've become probably more risk averse. I don't think it's that they can't have the skills to leverage these different channels that are out there. You can hire for that, right? Like you can bring on a team of Gen Zs and have a really awesome TikTok account or a YouTube channel. I don't think that's the problem. What I think the problem is that we are in a very strange place on this long journey of climate and ESG that where before it was around awareness. And so you can do these big, fun, wild campaigns to get eyeballs. So then they really got the world. Let's say the world was online. We had the Paris Agreement. We have all these COP meetings. But in the last few years, it's been this a weird implementation space where these particular groups are focused on the regulatory policy discussion. So they're very much engaging on that high level place, which doesn't translate very well to general population conversation. And as you were saying, it sort of opened this window up for the anti climate activists to step in and fill that void.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about one of the successful climate activists of the last 5 to 10 years, Greta Thunberg. Like, I feel she's one that has been able to activate and recruit a significant user base. And she was very successful until 2021, something like that, maybe. But ever since, she just hasn't been making the headlines as much, despite the fact that she's still very active, in particular around the Palestine issue this year. But it's not making the same headlines as it used to. Any thoughts on why the sudden decline for somebody who was able to activate emerging media?
Well, because she was a young kid before and she's not a young kid anymore. I mean, to me, that was part of the charm of Greta was she was this very young girl. Uh, so, people, media love what's new, what's unique, what's different. Well, now she's not that really young girl anymore. She's what, a young 20-year-old. So she's just one in a million. She still has obviously a lot of cachet to her name. But as you said, she's focused on Gaza and she's not talking about climate as much. And
Yeah.
so it's a bit more of a polarizing subject that she's participating in, I would say, than she has in the past.
I'd like you, could you pull up the data? This is data that 996 looked at and compiled in early 2021 to 2023. And we looked at the mentions of climate change over the course of a few years. This particular version that you're looking at looks at climate change and ESG in conjunction with some of the top 100 Fortune 100 companies. And what's really interesting here is to see um, the change in that volume over time. And you can see a peak in early 2022. And I think this corresponds to the last great COP meeting in 2021, December 2021. That was the one in what was the town in the UK? I
Oh, it was in
think
Scotland, but I forget exactly
Scotland.
which city town it was in. Yeah.
And I feel this was really the peak of the climate change public conversation. This is where everybody got together. And I feel that that was really a big showcase. And my suspicion here is the general public kind of took note of that and said, hey, you know what? Okay, great. Climate change solved. We are done now. The chart that you're seeing here are mentions of these top Fortune 100 organizations. And you can see, so it peaks in early 2022 and then continuously shrinks for 3 years running. Now, my suspicion here is all of these organizations made these commitments not really understanding the amount of work that would be required to do this. And this is not just investing, in better or more environmentally friendly products. These are huge supply chains that need to be shifted. There's new technologies that need to be developed, uh, and that comes at a significant cost that I'm assuming nobody had really budgeted for.
Right.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and not to mention the cottage industry that's strung up with every consultant and advisory from here to Timbuktu that was suddenly, offering ESG consulting services, and we're going to help you with your reporting, and we're going to help you with your transparency, and we're going to measure and your KPIs. And I think the kind of time and money that got invested into this, alongside what was in the end shifting goal, kept shifting. So who are you aligning to? And there was like four or five different international KPIs or definitions that different companies were trying to align to. But the language kept being adjusted every year because there were so many different stakeholders that were trying to influence where it would finally end up. And there was so much navel gazing as part of that process, and so much money that went down the drain as part of that process, that a lot of people in the business community, the finance community, and government, I think, started to wash their hands of this. And this is sort of why we've seen this shift away. And for the NGOs who this was their raison d'etre, right? And then it becomes, well, what do they do now? All of these banks, as an example, are walking away from these international communities that they joined to say we're going to be net zero, and now they're saying, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. I think they're also just a little bit like, what's our next step?
Yeah.
Because they thought that they were really making the ultimate traction, like the impact was so tangible, and it's sort of falling apart before their eyes right now. So they could just be in that place where they're regrouping and trying to figure out, how do we stop the bleeding that they're facing. But in this moment of quiet from them, and overall governments and corporates who aren't really sure how to move forward, you have this rise of these activists who are very, very capable of getting their message out. They're capable of riling their bases, and who are just questioning the whole point of what we're doing here on ESG. And that, of course, impacts public perception, to say, well, why are we bothering with plastic straws? Why are we bothering with not being able to get a plastic bag? Why are we bothering when, if these huge, massive companies who are producing all these products for us aren't going to do anything about it, what is little old me sitting in my own little home going to do about it?
Yeah. So to summarize, essentially what could have happened here is, in 2021, we have this big celebration. Okay, we've all agreed to deal with climate change. Then the governments and other bureaucrats need to go away and actually figure out, how the hell do we do this? And in that sudden silence steps in the counter climate change folks, who address and raise questions about some of the measures and how we are going to achieve this. These are valid concerns to have in how do you trade off in between all of these different goals.
Okay, well, let's wrap up. Again, I think if you're relying on old school stakeholder engagement with periodic meetings with some of the big names, you're going to be missing the boat, and that you need to really transition yourself to having a pulse across much smaller but still influential accounts, touch your industry, that touch your competitors, because otherwise you're going to be on the back foot when a campaign comes your way. So there's got to be a shift in how stakeholder engagement and NGO engagement is considered.
I'd agree to that. I think if we classify it, some of the NGOs with more climate change and left leaning agendas have lost momentum. But I am certain, and we are seeing it in our data, that newer, more agile organizations are starting to pick up some of the learnings from the right leaning activists and apply those lessons. So, in the very near future, you might already be seeing it now. Uh, we're starting to see those first signs of success as some of these agenda items are being resurfaced, given a new life, perhaps a new name, but still the same purpose.
All right. NGOs always been a bit of a controversial topic. Some people think they're fighting the good fight. Some people think they are just getting in the way for their own um, misdirected ambitions. But either way, still one to keep an eye on. So thank you as always, Emmanuel, and we will see everyone next time.
See you next time.